Now that I have the handles glued on, the next step for me is to put the guides on and get them spaced correctly. In this case, the rod I'm making personally, so I'm not going to go into the testing of the lines and bending the rod and all that type of thing. I'm just going to use a CRB kit, which has the spinning guides. It has the measurements on it already for guide placing, guessing. It's not rocket science, but this gives you a best guess as to where you would want to place your guides initially. Then you could move them around based on, you don't want the line to touch the rod itself, or you don't want the line to be too far away and being suspended between the guides. So being that this is a 7.5 foot rod, I've used these spacings on a number of rods. They seem to work out well enough for me. I do crappie fishing, and a 2 to 3 pound crappie is what I would catch. If I happen to snag a catfish, which is 20, 30 pounds, I'd on a 6 to 8 pound test line, I may just cut the line. I mean, or just see what happens with it. But it's not going to make that much of a difference for me if I have a little bit of line drag on either the rod, if I was doing a casting rod, or if dragging between the guides. But what I found that the recommendations are pretty close. You can go to, if you don't buy a kit, you can buy a number of guides, and there's a number of sites, there's different forums, fishing forums, rod building forums, that have recommended guide placements so that you can get them placed in a close position to where you want them. And then once you get them placed, you can bend your rod at a 90-degree angle, and that bend is going to be different in every rod. And so where the biggest bend is where you need to look for your guide placement. And when that's where you may need to move the guides, you may need to add another guide. Uh, each uh, each rod is going to be different. Each guide is going to be different if you're using micro guides versus a guide set like I'm just doing. I've Some of my rods I've bought more expensive guides. This is just a rod I wanted to build, and just use a run of the mill guides. So I'll take you through the video of mapping it out, mapping out the rod, marking it, and then get the positions for this. The guides I'm using for this rod are a CRB spinning guide set, and they come with 10 different guides and uh, the hook saver, whatever you call that deal. And on the kit, they have recommended guide placement. So this is not rocket science. These are recommendations for best guess. And this would be a good starting point to measure out your rod, and then mark the rod in each one of these positions for the guides, position the guides, and then decide if that's where you really want them. The way I mark the rod is this is a China marker, and I've had issues where if I put a China marker on the rod and then add the thread, China marker actually comes off on the thread, and so then I've got white in the China marker. So what I do is, I've started doing, is I've got 10 guides, and I'm going to cut uh, 10 pieces of masking tape, This is a 1/4 inch tape. And then I'll just take those and mark the rod accordingly for each one of these. So my first guide, according to my standard rule of thumb guide spacing kit, should be 2 3/4 inches from the tip. So I've got the tip lined up with the edge of the uh, ruler, and 2 3/4 will be right here. Like I said, this is not rocket science. So I know that this end of my tape is where I need to get the ring of that guide to be. So the ring, kind of hard when they're tiny like this. Will be right there at the edge. And that way I can get this guide aligned, get it threaded up, then remove the tape without any issues. Okay. So there's my first one. Next one is 6 inches in. I don't need this much tape. But it's not tearing, so I'm just going to wrap it. And the other thing with using tape versus a paint pen or a China marker, the tape can come off very easily. So my next one is at 9 3/4. And there's probably 100 different ways to mark the rod. Next one will be at 14 inches. And like I've said, this is not an exact science. This is a guideline for getting these guides placed correctly. 18 7/8. They make it sound like it when you do a 18 7/8, but like I said, the guides will be placed accordingly. So here's how the tape turned out. 10 different guides. Kind of hard to show a 7.5 foot rod. So now that I've got the guides all marked up, I can start doing my thread work to actually mount the guides.